Good evening and welcome to a very special Wiener Vorlesung with the Nobel laureate for economics, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Now, before I introduce Professor Stiglitz properly and we get to the heart of the matter of today's event, it's my pleasure to invite onto the stage Veronika Kaup-Hasler, Stadträtin für Kultur here in the city of Vienna. Veronika.
It is indeed an inspiring evening we have ahead of us, and I'm very pleased to have you both on stage, especially Professor Stiglitz. It's an honor to have you here, and I think the question you raised in the recent times and since a long time, how do we rethink capitalism? Can there be another version, but this destructive notion we all endure and we have? And is there a way to rethink that term and to rethink freedom, to rethink all this for a better society? What should be included? These are so crucial thoughts and visions you have, and it's just the right place here at the Viennese City Hall, the Rathaus, where politics meets public all the time, and where we are rethinking, even with our hard times we have and all the crises we have to face, but we have to constantly go to the bottom and to the core of these kind of questions you raise. So I'm leaving you the floor. I'm just honored and very inspired and, yeah, curious, of course. Good evening.
Veronika, thank you very much. It's a testimony to the city of Vienna and Austria in general that this city, Salzburg, other Austrian cities are inviting more and more critical thinkers to exchange their ideas, give their opinions, and in my experience, even over the last 3 years, this is becoming a really lively place to be intellectually, very stimulating. But it's also a very important time for us to encourage that intellectual stimulation because we have to be very frank. We are living in a dangerous and difficult world, one which is much more dangerous and difficult than anything I've experienced in my lifetime. And so we're extremely grateful for people like Joseph Stiglitz to come here and give us ideas about how we go forward in this really troublesome atmosphere that we're all experiencing, to give us some hope and some direction. And as I say, there are few people who are better at doing that than Joseph Stiglitz, who is an American economist. He's a public policy analyst. It's fair to call him a political activist. I don't know whether he feels that way as well. But he is also a professor at Columbia University, and I'm sure we're going to be discussing Columbia University later on about what is happening there and to American universities in general. He is, of course, a Nobel laureate in economics and a former chief economist of the World Bank. He's also a former chair of the US Council of Economic Advisors, particularly well known under Bill Clinton. And I'm pleased to say he's a former fellow of my institute, the Institute for Human Sciences, and is still a close friend of the IWM. He's also renowned for his stamina. I don't know if you know this, but he spends most of his time flying around the world, advising governments on economic policy. He's also a highly sought-after public speaker. It is a real pleasure welcoming Joseph Stiglitz, here to Vienna and to the Wiener Vorlesung. And tonight he's going to talk about The Road to Freedom, his latest book, whose subtitle is Economics and the Good Society. And that concept of the good society is something I'm going to interrogate a little later as well. But first, Professor Stiglitz will take to the stage and talk to us for about 35, 40 minutes, whatever takes his fancy.
Okay.
Joe.
Well,
You can stand or sit. Yeah, just press the big one.
no, you can. It's not working. Well, it's a real pleasure to be
right,
back
it isn't working.
back in Vienna, and if it doesn't work, it's not a disaster. Most of the people can't see it anyway. So, and the subject is really the one that should be absorbing all of us, which is what kind of an economic system will best enhance our well-being, strengthen our democracies, make us have a better society. And, you know, in that sense, it's a deeply philosophical issue, but it's also an analytic issue about how different economic systems work. I wrote the book in part before the last election in the hopes that it would help the election go in the right way. I have to say the book failed, and but I don't blame myself. But let me try to explain a little bit about the motivation of the book, which is the right wing in the United States, and it's also true in other countries, tries to claim for itself the notion of freedom. And in fact, the extreme right in the United States, the Republicans in Congress, call their group in Congress the Freedom Caucus. And, you know, they've tried to get a trademark on the idea that they are the party of freedom. My view was they did not understand what freedom was about. And so I wanted to write a book that explained what freedom was and explain why we Democrats, and I'm partisan, that people on the left actually understood what freedom was and had an agenda that would both increase freedom and enhance economic well-being and make for a better society. So that was really the motivation for the book. Now, I had a little bit of success in the sense that in the beginning of Kamala Harris's campaign, she began talking about freedom a lot. Okay. She began talking about freedom a lot, and she actually had Beyonce use freedom as her campaign song for a while. But as many of you know, politics often goes in strange ways, and freedom was not the major issue in the campaign. There were a lot of non-issues that were the big issues, and I don't have to tell you, Kamala Harris lost. And America lost, the world lost a lot. So what I want to do is explain some of the basic ideas underlying freedom, explain why the progressive agenda that I've been advocating is a better way of getting both more freedom and more efficiency, a better society. But maybe I should first begin by addressing a question I often get is, why is an economist talking about freedom? Isn't that something a philosopher or a political scientist ought to be talking about? But in fact, economists have long talked about the concept of freedom. One of the most important economists in the middle of the 19th century was John Stuart Mills, an English economist who wrote a treatise that is still read today called On Liberty. And then in the middle of the last century, two economists, one in the Austrian school, wrote about freedom. Milton Friedman wrote two books, one with his wife and one by himself, one called Capitalism and Freedom, and the other Free to Choose. Now, as a parenthesis, I should say, one of his and Hayek's argument was that economic freedom was absolutely critical for political freedom. But he didn't really care about political freedom, because one of the things he did famously was, as soon as Pinochet took over in Chile and was killing tens of thousands of people, he rushed down to Chile in order to use that dictatorship to force his peculiar ideas onto the Chilean people, using force, dictatorship, to get his ideas. And at great cost to Chile, his idea of free banking led to Chile's worst banking crisis, and it took Chile 25 years to dig itself out of the mess that Milton Friedman created. And they're still suffering in some ways from that legacy of what is called the Chicago School in Chile. Anyway, so he wrote one book, and then Friedrich Hayek, both Hayek and Friedman got that Nobel Prize, which should tell you that you shouldn't take too seriously the qualification of getting a Nobel Prize. It doesn't necessarily mean that they know any economics. So, but Hayek wrote the book, The Road to Serfdom. The context in which he wrote the book was that there was a Great Depression in the beginning in the 1930s. 1 out of 4 or 5 people were unemployed. The economic system was not working. Keynes wrote a very influential book explaining that was not inevitable. Government could intervene and sustain the economy at closer to full employment. And then in Scandinavia, and at that time even in the UK, people were discussing the role of government in the welfare state, providing health care and retirement benefits, things that we take for granted. I mean, not in the United States, but in the rest of the world, advanced country, take for granted. Hayek was worried that the government taking a role for assuring full employment and assuring people had health care and assuring that people had a retirement, things that seem good, he said that was setting the world on the economy on the road to serfdom. And serfdom is authoritarianism. Well, he couldn't have been more wrong. He got it 180 degrees wrong. The countries where you see authoritarian populism are more likely, authoritarian populism is stronger in countries where the government has done too little than it is in countries like where it's done more. You don't see it as strong in Scandinavia, Norway, or in Finland as you do see authoritarian populism in the United States right now. So he got those ideas wrong. So part of the motivation of this book was to explain why Hayek and Milton Friedman were so wrong in every aspect of what they claimed, in the economics, in the politics, in the moral justification for capitalism, and that there were another way of organizing society that was better. But I just want to comment that the language that these two people used has been very influential in shaping how we think about our economic system. So they used words like free markets and free enterprise. And we take those words almost for granted now. But those words are loaded words. Those are words that are politically motivated, because who could be against freedom? So if you're for freedom, how could you be against free enterprise? How could you be against free markets? But that wasn't really, they should have used the words private markets, private enterprise, and whether they were free or not is another question, and I'm going to come to that. So this is really an important lesson and something the Trump administration understands. Language is important. And the language that we use has an important role in shaping how we think. So part of my writing of the book was that there have been a lot of advances in economic theory since Friedman and Hayek wrote their work. And these advances in economic theory and our experiences with the concept of neoliberalism, let me just parentheses, neoliberalism, liberal is itself the word freedom. It was freeing. So they used, even in the term that they were describing their economic theory, freedom. And they called it neo, because they didn't want to say, I'm old. Everybody wants to be new. And they wanted to say they would revive, they were a new version of 19th century liberalism. But it wasn't a new version, it was the old version. It was another advertising stunt to make people think that there being some thinking over the last 100 years. They hadn't done any new thinking for 100 years, and it was really the old ideas. It's quite remarkable. There are people today, like in Argentina, Malay, 100 years later, who are still espousing the same ideas and with the same disastrous consequences. So the point is that these advances in economic theory and experiences over the past 40 years have exposed the limitations in these earlier analyses, and particularly suggest an alternative that I'll have just a little time to talk about that does a better job enhancing individual freedom, but also more broadly economic performance and societal well-being. And so, as I said, part of the objective of this talk is to recapture the freedom agenda for the progressives. So I'm going to begin with a broad economic perspective. As I say, I'm not going to deny I'm an economist, and I approached this deeply philosophical issue as an economist. And when we use the word freedom, it's what you can do, what your choices are. And the basic idea here is somebody who is at the point of starvation doesn't really have any freedom. He does what he has to do to survive. And then what we mean by expanding freedom is to giving people more choices, more things that they could do, enhancing their capabilities, enhancing education, better health, so they can make more meaningful choices in their lives. So that's really, for those of you who've had training in economics, we would call that enlarging their opportunity set, the sets of things that they can meaningfully make choices among. So that's the first basic idea. And the second basic idea is that for any society to function, there has to be some form of regulation and collective action, and that's because one person's freedom to act inevitably has, in many domains, effects on other people's freedom. So we live in an interdependent society, and let me give you just, the Ten Commandments is a simple set of regulations. We don't think of it that way, but it is a set of regulations. What, thou shalt not steal. That's a regulation that says to the thief, you're not allowed to do that. And it's actually a statement about property rights. Thou shalt not kill. It's a property right. You have the right to live, and somebody else can't take you. It seems so obvious that you say, well, that's not a regulation. But it is. And in America, we are debating regulations like that. So one of the big debates in America is it a fundamental right of everybody to carry around an AK-47 machine gun? And the Republicans are saying that is a fundamental human right. Now, that right means that every day in the United States, somewhere, there will be a mass murder. And a couple weekends ago, there were 4 mass murders over one weekend. It has another effect on, so taking that right to carry an AK-47 is taking away other people's right to live. But it's taking away another right, which one of our really great presidents talked about, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He gave a famous speech called The Four Freedoms, and one of the freedoms was, in a little bit different context, but still, freedom from fear. Every parent now in the United States worries that when their kid goes to school, will he come home? Because some guy will enter the school with a machine gun and mow them down. When I was a little kid, we had to have training for what to do in the event of an air raid, of a nuclear war. We were still the era of, and people had bomb shelters, and we had to learn in school, what to do. It wouldn't have saved us, but it was part of our one of the things we did. But today, in almost every American school, kids have to learn what to do when a gunman enters into the school. Can you imagine what that does to the lives of the children? It's a kind of fear that they are all living with every day. And unfortunately, it's a fear that is not unreasonable given what's happening so frequently in the United States. So that highlights the point that one person's freedom, the right to carry a gun, takes away other people's freedom. Well, I put it unpoetically, one person's freedom is another person's unfreedom. But there's a great philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, who put it much more poetically. He said, freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. And this example is over and over again something we have to decide in our society. We just gone through COVID-19. The question was vaccinations and masks. Vaccinations requirements took away your freedom. But not wearing a mask or not getting a vaccination meant other people got the disease. Some of them would be hospitalized and some would die. So every society has to, over and over again, confront these decisions of trade-offs. Increasing one person's freedom is taking away the others. And in the examples I gave, I think most reasonable societies will come to the same conclusion. More important to live than to carry a AK-47. The inconvenience of having to wear a mask is less important than the ability not to get the disease, to live, not to be hospitalized or to die. But there are other cases, I have to admit, where you need a town hall of people getting together and deciding how do we weigh these freedoms. And these are the most difficult and vexed issues that our societies face. Now, there's another important idea I want to get across, and that is that some coercion can be freeing for everyone. That seems like a conundrum. How could that be? We used to think coercion is a bad thing. The example that I think helps bring that home is traffic lights. A traffic light is a regulation. Again, we don't think about it as a regulation. We're so ingrained to thinking regulations are bad. But traffic lights are a simple regulation. It says you cannot cross the intersection until it's green. And if you do that, if you violate that regulation, you'll get a fine, right? So it's a regulation. But think about our society if we did not, at least in New York and probably in some parts of Vienna, if you didn't have traffic lights, if you didn't have the regulation, you'd have gridlock. Nobody could move. So a simple regulation acts as a coordinating device and enables us to move when it increases all of our freedom in a fundamental way. It gives us, increases our opportunity set, what we can do, even though it says at that particular moment, you're restrained. Now that's I use that example, and it sounds like a very special example, but it actually is a metaphor for many, many, many of the things, choices that we as a society confront. So an example, let me go back to COVID-19. We might not be able to be here in this space talking with each other if COVID-19 had continued. What stopped COVID-19? Probably the most important thing was the vaccines. The vaccines were quickly developed on the basis of the mRNA platform. That mRNA platform was developed in universities like University of Pennsylvania, but developing that platform didn't come without, just out of thin air, like manna from heaven. It took resources. How do you get those resources? Taxation. What is taxation? Coercion. So a little coercion forcing you to pay a little bit of money so that we could have a vaccine that means that we could talk to each other and maybe some of us could live or not be hospitalized, has enhanced our freedom. So taxes, which are a form of coercion, can actually expand our opportunity set, can expand our freedom in a meaningful way. So that's the third basic idea I wanted to get across, that in fact a little bit of coercion can be fundamentally freeing. Now, let me skip forward and talk a little bit about bring it back to I'm sorry. Oh, wait, no. How do I go back? Okay. Let me go back, bring this back to discussions of our economic system. So, what I would argue is that Friedman and Hayek's views that capitalism enhances individual freedom were flawed, both because their analysis of individual liberty in an interdependent society was fundamentally flawed, but also their understanding of economics was flawed. One of their beliefs was that if you just leave markets to themselves, they'll be naturally competitive. Well, anybody who saw the inauguration of President Trump with all the oligarchs bending their knees to him know that unfettered capitalism leads to monopolies. And there's a good economic theory that says that markets are not naturally competitive. There are strong forces of collusion. Adam Smith actually talked about the strong forces of collusion in a market economy. One of the other ideas that Milton Friedman had was maximizing shareholder value, he said, is what every firm should do. Don't care about anybody except your shareholder. Just maximize your shareholder value, and that will maximize societal well-being. Maybe I'll tell a little story about that. So when I was quite young, wrote a paper showing that was wrong. And they invited me to the University of Chicago to give a talk on the subject. And so I went through my mathematical scribbles showing that shareholder value maximization did not maximize societal well-being. So after the talk, Milton came up to me and said, Joe, you're wrong. And I said, Milt, which assumption did I make that you didn't like, or where in my mathematics had I made a mistake? He said, Joe, you're wrong. And I said, we went on like that for a few minutes, and it was very clear he was not going, he wasn't thinking analytically. He was an ideologue. He thought companies should maximize the value of their shares. And it was a religious belief, and there was no way I could move him. No way we could have a dialogue on that. But he published his argument in the New York Times Magazine. I published my papers in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the Journal of Finance. Who do you think had more influence? Well, it was a rhetorical question. He had a lot more influence than I did, partly because I was young. So many states in the United States adopted laws saying companies had to maximize their shareholder value. And a CEO that did not do that could be sued. So that's where the legal structure actually interacts with the economic structure, and he, but he was wrong. And now, increasingly, we now recognize that is wrong. More broadly, Hayek and Friedman and that whole neoliberal school underestimated or ignored a host of market failures like externalities, imperfections of information, incomplete markets that have been really the center of research over the last 50 years. And then there were other problems. I don't have time to go into them, but like the underlying model of the individual was flawed, that there are well-defined fixed preferences, that people are rational and perfectly rational and perfectly selfish. Now, as economics teachers, we try to make our students become more selfish. It's one of the, and there's actually evidence that we succeed, that the longer students study economics, the more selfish they become. But it is not the natural state of humans to be, I think, perfectly selfish. One of the things that I've been arguing is that neoliberal capitalism, the kind of capitalism that Friedman and the right have been advocating, is not even a sustainable institutional arrangement. It's obviously on its own not environmentally sustainable. We're at the planetary boundaries, not only climate change, but also water and many other things. It's not socially, politically, or economically sustainable. For instance, I've already mentioned, without government oversight, competition won't be sustained. The divides between the rich and the poor that it gives rise to, the polarization that it gives rise to, makes it politically unsustainable. The business model of America's social media, people like Zuckerberg, is engagement through enragement. So their business model is to polarize our society and making it more dysfunctional. They make more money when society performs more poorly. They make money out of scams. They made money out of the Rohingya massacre. They knew what they were doing, but they wouldn't take down that kind of content that was dividing that society. So that is just another example of an unsustainable arrangement. But importantly, it also encourages individual traits which undermine trust and make society unsustainable, and including undermining economic sustainability. So, you know, the model of what kind of an individual capitalism creates, this may be just a little bit unfair, but not a lot, is Donald Trump. Perfectly selfish, perfectly untrustworthy. He was famous in New York City for not paying his workers, saying, you know, yeah, I signed a contract, sue me. Knowing that most workers are not going to be able to have a lawyer, like he has a whole bevy of lawyers, and so he got away with it. But if every transaction resulted in a suit, our society can't function. So that's the kind, you know, but he's making money out of it. So that is what happens if you have a perfectly selfish kind of individual created by our society. Now, fortunately, capitalism doesn't succeed as much you know, not everybody is like Donald Trump, and our society is able to function a little bit better. But if everybody were like him, it would not. So the bottom line of this is neoliberal capitalism is a system that I think will devour itself. So that brings us to the critical question that I'm only going to be able to touch on. What kind of society, what kind of economy most likely to enhance the freedoms of most citizens and to perform well and to be sustainable politically, sustain democracy? And as I said, neoliberalism argued that freeing the economy stripping away regulations, reducing the size of the state, giving full rein to unfettered markets would lead to high growth, and the trickle-down economics ensured that the benefits would be shared by all. We've now had a 45-year experiment, and that's shown it leads actually to lower growth, more inequality, with those at the bottom in many countries actually seeing their real incomes fall. And this disillusionment has, I think, understandably led to the growth of authoritarian populism and is setting us on the road to fascism. So what is the answer? Well, what I propose in this book and some of my earlier books is what I call progressive capitalism. I don't like the word capitalism because capitalism is not at the center. The book was written for an American audience, and so you have to talk about capitalism. If I were doing it in Europe, I'd use something like social democracy. I think that's a better word because social means it's concerned with society, and democracy is a fundamental political value. So I like that term, but you know, I was writing partly for an American audience, as I said. And the basic idea is that there are alternative ways of organizing society that could do a better job enhancing freedom and our overall well-being. And what it entails is a better balance of the market and the state, a better balance of individual action and collective action. I would argue a richer ecology of institutions, including cooperatives, not-for-profits, government provision of services, what I call the public option, a whole array of forms of collective action like unions, civil society, class action suits. You know, much of our discussions in the popular literature is private versus public. But in fact, you know, I come from Columbia University. It's not a for-profit institution. It's not a governmental institution. And until Trump came along, it was working pretty well. And the same thing for Harvard, Princeton, Yale. Most of our, you know, let me put it, all of our best educational institutions are either state institutions like University of California or these NGOs. These, they're not for-profits, but they're not state institution. So I think this kind of broad institutional structure is the kind of framework that is best in creating efficiency and equity and giving more freedom to choose. One of the things I want to emphasize, particularly in light of what is happening in the United States, is the importance of checks and balances. And we all learned in school about the importance of checks and balances within government. But we didn't spend as much time thinking about checks and balances within our society. And if you allow a few people to have enormous amount of economic power, like America's oligarchs, that economic power gets translated in one way or another into political power. And my argument is that, therefore, some form of limiting the extremes of inequality is necessary as part of our societal systems of checks and balances. Another important part of these checks and balances is academic freedom. Having the academy looking at what's going on and being able to criticize. This is not working, making suggestions of what might work better. But still, another part of our systems, of our control systems in our society, is a free press. And, I can't emphasize how important that is as part of our systemic checks and balances. And it's precisely because academic freedom and press freedom are so important that Donald Trump is attacking it now. Orban attacks it in Hungary, and you see it in all the authoritarian regimes. And, what's so upsetting for me as an American is what we've seen this playbook of authoritarianism. We watched it in Hungary. We watched it in Turkey. And scene after scene, what we're seeing in the United States is exactly that. It's not always putting people in jail, it's using coercion in one form or another. It's using fear in one form or another. It's taking away, it's using economic tools as instruments of coercion. And so one of the, you cannot have a really free press if it's controlled by the oligarchs in society. And that's part of what has happened in the United States. And it's not only the media, but the social media. The town square, the electronic town square is controlled by Zuckerberg and Musk. And their algorithms, which determine what you see and our societal narratives, are those that promote their interest and their way of seeing the world, and nothing to do with an objective reality. So, in my view, having a free press and having academic freedom and press freedom is absolutely essential, but that means you cannot have the kind of concentrations of power that we have in the way we've organized our media. So let me just conclude. I've given you a little bit of a hint of that I don't think things are going well in the United States. And that, but I do think that there is an alternative model, what I called, progressive capitalism, rejuvenated social democracy, which is a framework that could actually create a society, a better society where people are more cooperative, where more individuals have the opportunity to live up to their potential, and in that sense, have more freedom, freedom in a meaningful way, and democracy is an essential part of that. Our human rights are an essential part of that, and today those are under attack, and I think we have to have an alternative vision of what kind of society we want to create, that there is an alternative, and that's what I'm trying to put forward in my book. Thank you.
Joe, thanks very much for that grand sweep, going back to John Stuart Mill's On Liberty and up to the present day. So before we get into the specific of the economics of Trump and his friends, I want to go back a little bit in history and pick out two particular maybe three particular points. First of all is we saw in the United States from the late 30s, and this was particularly enhanced by the Second World War, through to the early to mid-1970s, a broadly Keynesian strategy for the American economy. Now, it wasn't neoliberalism that led to that failure in the early 70s and mid-70s. Neoliberalism exploited that failure to assert itself. But what was it, briefly, that went wrong by the 1970s and the consensus that had been built up by Franklin Delano Roosevelt collapsed?
So first, let me say, that period was an enormously successful period. If you look at the quarter century, 20 years after World War II, it was the fastest rate of growth that we've ever had. It was the most egalitarian growth. The people at the bottom had their incomes grow faster than the people at the top. Interestingly, it was a period where we had the highest tax rates. Tax rates at the top were over 80%. And our economy really functioned well. So that leads to the question, why was this successful model not continued? Well, I think there were two things that one was something that really did happen, and we didn't manage it very well. We had inflation, and the inflation was caused by a whole variety, two factors in the United States. We had the oil price shocks, the Middle East. Middle East often causes problems, and we had the war in Vietnam, and the U.S. government, President Johnson, did not want to admit how much he was spending on that war, and so the government tried to pretend that it was spending less than it was, and we overspent. So we had the inflation. Individuals really don't like inflation. And, for economists, some of that hatred of inflation is hard to understand because prices go up and wages go up, and it's a changing yardstick. As long as wages and prices go up in tandem, what's the big deal? But there's lots of theories about why people get so upset, but part of the answer is when the wages go up, they think it's because they worked hard and they were brilliant. When prices go up, they believe it's because government mismanaged and stole away the increases from their hard work. So they blame the government for the price increase and not realizing the wage increase is just part of the way that yardstick is moving. Regardless, that was the failure to be able to contain inflation was a major source of the problem. The second one was the role of ideas. I think ideas really do matter. I mean, obviously, I'm in the ideas business, but ideas matter. And Milton Friedman, the Mount Pelerin Society, Hayek, had been engaged since the Great Depression in attacking Keynesian economics. A majority of economists thought Keynes was radical. My view was Keynes was conservative. He was trying to save capitalism from the capitalist. They were willing to let the capitalism go down. He said, no, I believe in capitalism if I can only get us back to full employment. since the 30s. They had been campaigning against the role of government, like Hayek. So it was a long-term project, 40, 50 years, and eventually those ideas resonated. And I think they resonated because of the inflation. Something was wrong, and here was an alternative vision.
And they were able to find in Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher two powerful politicians who were willing to introduce more or less wholesale these radical reforms that you've described. And of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that gave a boost to the idea that what had been happening in the 1980s was the right way, was the right strategy, and the West had won the Cold War. But I want to talk to you about a part of this which you know intimately, and to do that I will quote Margaret Thatcher, who, this is an apocryphal story, who, when asked what her greatest success was, she replied, Tony Blair. And that is the idea that it was Tony Blair in the United Kingdom and Bill Clinton in the United States who actually, in the name of social democracy, took up neoliberalism, embraced it, and we continued to hurtle towards the first climax of neoliberalism, 2008, the financial crash. So, you were in the room during this time, Joe. So explain to us why social democracy came to be so aligned with a Thatcherite and Reaganite strategy, and indeed a Friedmanite strategy.
Yeah, I mean, and it wasn't only Tony Blair, it was Schroeder in Germany. This was where the center, the view was, it was called the third way, between communism on the one hand and unfettered free markets on the other. But there's a huge range between those two, and unfortunately they settled on something that was so close to social democracy, to Thatcherism, that to be almost indistinguishable. You know, I used to say that only the main difference between the Democrats and the Republicans at that point in the United States, these were reasonable Republicans, not what we have today, was that when the Democrats did things that were bad, they felt bad about it. Whereas the Republicans enjoyed seeing people suffer. So that was, Bill Clinton was very good about, pursing his lips and making you feel that he felt your pain. That was a word, I feel your pain. And but there was a difference. Let me say that at that point, and it's different from what happened a little bit later, in the first Clinton administration, we had Bob Reich and me arguing that we ought to be really worried about inequality. We ought to be doing something about the environment. Al Gore was on the, talking about the environment. And then you had Bob Rubin and talking about
Larry Summers was
and Larry Summers, and they, and let me say, so they were talking about financial sector deregulation. Larry Summers was even, talking about tax cuts, capital gains tax cuts for the billionaires. And even Bob Rubin found that difficult to take. But Bill Clinton did something that was called triangulation. He was trying to capture what he thought were people on the right into the Democratic Party. So it was a political strategy without any philosophy. It was one, if we could get so far right that we get everybody in our tent, then the Republicans won't have anybody in their tent. And it almost, in some sense, succeeded in the sense that the Republican Party was getting into more and more of a minority party, except the problem was then that because you hadn't paid attention to the people who were suffering from deindustrialization, you got a lot of those who had been in the Democratic Party flipping over into the Republican Party, and that was then you got all these disaffected.
So, and that facilitated, in the first instance, George W. Bush, although...
But he's reasonable compared to what we have today.
I think it's one of Trump's greatest achievements is to have turned George W. Bush into an elder statesman who is wise and very strange. Anyway, but going back to 2000, or moving forward, so I don't want to dwell on 2008 too much. Suffice to say that taxpayers bailed out the banks for their outrageous speculative activity in the lead up to 2008. But what I do want to ask you about is 2010 and Citizens United, because that seems to me to be a really devastating blow against democratic mechanisms. Can you explain about Citizens United?
That links with the basic idea that I said before, that whenever you have too much economic inequality, it gets translated into political inequality. But the extent to which that is the case depends on the political rules of the game. And it depends on the ability to use money in politics. And I think it's almost inconceivable for people in Europe to understand the role of money in American politics. You know, that a presidential election today costs billions, I said billions of dollars. And when somebody, you know, corporations, individuals make what they call campaign contributions, they're not really charitable contributions, they're investments. They're investments to get something back. And I actually was in a discussion with one of the senators from West Virginia who said, you know, he was championing this idea of investment. He said, what I like about campaign contributions is because we have real accountability. They only give us money because they expect a return. And he thought of that as part of the system of accountability. And we thought of that as a disaster. So this particular case was a Supreme Court case that said that individuals have an unfettered right to give money for campaign purposes because money is part of free speech. And so, and there was a later case that was even worse than this. It was a case in Arizona, about Arizona, because the state of Arizona then passed a law saying that if one candidate got a lot of money, the state would, if you limited your campaign, top up the money so that there was a fair competition. And the Supreme Court said that that was inherently unfair because it was inherently the right of those with more money to express their views in the political process by having that inequality.
Wow.
So they actually stopped Arizona from trying to level up the playing field, saying that was itself a violation of free speech. Now, it's hard to wrap your mind around that kind of reasoning. But that is what the Republican Supreme Court, the way of reasoning that they have today, which is why there's a lot of disillusionment with the way our political system is working.
The reason why I mentioned, well, one of the reasons why I mentioned Citizens United, which enabled huge super PACs, that's sort of corporate money, to be identified
Which is secret,
as
often.
individuals, exactly, without accountability of where it necessarily came from, is because of that important point you made at the beginning about narrative and the importance of narrative, the appropriation of freedom, but also the name Citizens United sounds like a bottom-up NGO, classic democratic movement. And that phrase was appropriated by big capital, by huge capital, in order to ensure their control over the political process. That is a moment of political genius on the part of those monopoly capitalists. And that brings me on to the next question, this thing about monopoly capitalism and how we have seen, as a consequence of neoliberalism and technological developments, the creation of these vast companies with immense influence, not just on politics, but on society through communications and so on and so on and so forth. But Joe, have we ever seen the emergence of a monopoly capitalism like this at the speed and to the extent that it has been happening over the past 10 to 15 years? Or let's take the iPhone, the invention of the iPhone 2007, or the launch of the iPhone as that. Are we not seeing things at a scale that is almost incomprehensible to the human mind?
That's right, and I think it is, and what it's been, you might say, accelerated, put on steroids by financial markets. So to understand, I mean, what has happened is that these companies have had enormous stock market valuations because people think that they're going to make a lot of profits going forward. The reason they believe they're going to make a lot of profits going forward is they know that there is very limited competition, that these are monopolies. Let me just parenthesize, as a parenthetical, a lot of people in Europe say, we don't have any of these huge trillion-dollar companies. And I've jokingly said, well, you know, the fact that America has these trillion-dollar companies is testimony to a failure in the United States. And people look at me, what do you mean failure? And the failure is what? Failure of competition policy, because if any of you have taken a basic economics course, whenever you have profits, you're supposed to get entry, and that drives down profits. But if there's no entry, if you have barriers to entry, then you have profits, and then you have a trillion-dollar company. So the existence of the trillion-dollar companies is testimony to the failure of America's antitrust policy. Well, the financial markets know that this has failed. They capitalize on it. The value of the company goes up. They have all this fake money, if you want, in the stock value, and they use that money to buy other companies. And then that leads to more and more of that kind of, and they use that money, you know, to buy, you know, Facebook buys Instagram, or WhatsApp, and they buy other companies, and that gives more and more concentration of power because they have more and more of this fake money. And so you're absolutely right. There's never been this kind of accelerated concentration of power, economic power, and it the origins is a failure to have a competition policy and some natural barriers to entry, plus financial market acceleration.
Okay, Joe, I want to ask before we finish, time is already running out, but we still got a little bit of time. Before we get to the vision, you spoke about we need a vision. I want to hear what your vision is. Before we get there, I want to ask specifically about Trump's economic policies and where they are heading, and specifically as part of Europe is concerned, but also the global economy. What are these tariffs doing to the world? What is the tariff policy doing?
Well, I mean, it's terrible. Trump is motivated by a series of grievances, obsessions, and misperceptions. He lives in a world of the 1950s where everybody liked cars. He thinks the only thing that matters is trade in real goods like automobiles, and doesn't understand trade in services. The U.S. economy is less than 10%, 9% share of goods. Most of it, the services, is overwhelming. And not surprisingly, our exports of services are enormous. We have a trade surplus in services. Or we did. We used to export a lot of education services. People used to want to go to American universities. Now it's not so clear that it's a good place to send your children because you may lose a...
Oh, something's happening. Can you...
No. They may lose they may not get, they may lose their visa at any moment. Tourism is a major service. That's way down. Health services. So the basic...
Take that
okay. The basic problem is that he lives in the mid-20th century and thinks the only thing that matters are goods. He thinks that trade is a zero sum. If some country is doing well, some other country must be doing badly rather than gains from trade. He thinks that because the United States is the best country in the world, everybody should be buying our goods, and we shouldn't be buying other countries' goods. So we should have a surplus with every country. Now, economists know that just can't be. I mean, you have to have a trade balance. But he actually thinks that way. And if you remember in April, he had a chart showing the tariffs, including some islands, some places with no people on them. And what were those tariffs? Those were the magnitude of the trade deficit. But what he's doing is even worse. He's using trade policy as a club against anything that any country does that he doesn't like. So Brazil has a trade deficit with the United States. So in his theory, Brazil should be imposing a tariff against the United States because we are unfair to Brazil. But he has levied a 50% tariff against Brazil because Brazil brought a case against Bolsonaro, who imitated what happened on January 6th. They had the January 8th attempt to undo a democratic election. Bolsonaro was tried and convicted. And Trump didn't like that. So he imposed and continues to impose a 50% tariff. So it's totally destroying a rules-based international trade order. He wants to gather for the United States more of the surplus associated with international trade.
Okay, Joe, with all of that going on, mine's not working either, or it's only partially working, I'll use both. With all of that going on, when I talk to my friends in the United States, when I talk to Democrats and progressives, there is an increasing belief that this is a systematic, albeit in a very chaotic style, but nonetheless a systematic attempt to ensure that a minoritarian government takes power and remains in power in the United States, i.e. a dictatorship. If that is the case, if that is what's happening, this is when I want to hear your vision of how we do something about this. What are the political and the economic strategies that we need in order to prevent this slide into dictatorship in the US?
Yeah. So first, let me say, I'm among those who think that the U.S. is sliding into a dictatorship. You see the encroachment in area after area, a violation of the rule of law, due process. It's an encroachment, little by little. It's like boiling a frog, hoping that people won't jump out. So every day it's a little new outrage. Well, if we accepted yesterday's outrage, why not accept today's outrage? So that is the basic model that is going on. Now, let me just give a message, I think, for Europe first, and then I think it's both difficult for Americans and people in the rest of the world to come to terms with what has happened in the last 8 months. It's just so inconceivable, but what is inconceivable is happening, and so you have to conceive of it. It is a reality. It may not end in the dire way that some of us see, but it would be foolhardy not to see that as a real possibility, and I would say a probability. We're going to, we'll have elections. Putin has elections. But we already have troops in the streets, and we will have more troops in the streets when come elections that will be located near polling booths where Hispanics vote, where Democrats vote. They will have a chilling effect in the voting. So in addition to the normal ways of discouraging voting by making it difficult to have voting booths and other things of suppressing voting, it will be this is not something that one should dismiss. I mean, as I say, there's already troops in the street, and you ask why, what is going on, what is the objective, and I think it's certainly consistent with that view. So if this is right, then Europe has to get its head around the idea that the United States, which has been a trusted partner since World War II, is not a reliable partner. It is, it has a different agenda in terms of human rights and democracy, and Europe becomes the last bastion of democracy and human rights. And that puts an enormous burden on Europe. Now, that means also the policies have to change. So my view is that Europe capitulated to Trump's demands. It was a capitulation that is totally ununderstandable if you looked at it in terms of economics. Europe is as large an economy, larger in trade than the United States. Why should Europe pay to have access to the U.S. rather than U.S. paying to have access to Europe? Where's the asymmetry? But there is an asymmetry, and that has to do with defense. There's a war in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine, and I believe that winning that war is absolutely essential. And right now, Europe depends on munitions from the United States. It doesn't have to be that way. I mean, Ukraine has shown that it has been able to develop a drones industry very quickly in the middle of a war. And so, my view is there are two things that are absolutely urgent for Europe, and really, there's an immediacy of this that van der Leyen and Brussels so far has not understood. One, defense independence. If you don't have independent defense, you've lost your national economic your national sovereignty. You capitulated on the trade deal, but 2 weeks later, what did Trump say? You have to give up your Digital Services Act, your Digital Marketing Act, who knows what other acts. So if you accept your dependence on the United States, you are giving up your democracy in Europe. And the only way to have that is to have defense sovereignty and technology sovereignty. You are totally dependent on the U.S. cloud. Amazon is not reliable, as everybody saw this week. But all of your government data is on Amazon or on another U.S. cloud provider. And if Trump says, I don't want Europe to have access to their own data, you will lose it. These oligarchs are subservient to Trump. They showed that. You have that picture. And so you lose your access to your own data. This could change overnight. There's nothing, you have that technology. You have that capability. So to me, so part of the story of the answer, I'm sorry going so long, but I think this is a really important message, is if you're going to have your national sovereignty at the European level, at the national level, you have to have both defense and technology independence.
Joe, excellent message. One with which I concur. I would point out that the Danish government about 2 months ago decided to dispense with the services of Microsoft and to have replaced all of Microsoft in the Danish government administration with Office Libre, which is an open source European company. Now, Denmark obviously has a pressing reason to do this, which is Greenland. But I think it sets a mark which may be followed by other states in Europe. We've only got a tiny bit of time left, Joe, so what I'm going to ask you as a final question, what are you going to do in the United States to hold back the tide of Trumpism on steroids, the tech bros, the MAGA guys, et al.?
Well, obviously, you saw the No Kings protests. Let me say, these are the largest protests that have ever occurred in the United States, and probably among the largest protests anywhere in the world. On the same day, in hundreds and hundreds of cities across the United States, people went to protest. So, you know, that's part, yeah, and I won't make a comment about the reaction of Trump and the juvenile video that he put out, but shows his disrespect for the fundamental rights of citizens, and that he is, you know, a normal politician, doesn't alienate, doesn't polarize, but he's not trying to win the hearts and minds of Americans, which leads to part of the view that it's force that is going to be used, not political persuasion. My judgment is the likely economic consequences of Trumpism are going to be very bad for most Americans. Health insurance prices are skyrocketing. When the tariffs go fully in force, there will be price effects. There has been literally almost no job creation. Americans depend on migrants. They harvest our food. They work in our restaurants. They do the construction. The tech companies are all, you know, half the engineers are immigrants. Our universities depend on immigrants. He wants our universities to pay $100,000 for or all Americans for every high-skilled person that is hired, and that means not hiring foreigners. Again, a wonderful opportunity for Europe. And Americans are going to be looking for jobs in Europe, and Europeans who have located in America are coming back. And you know, I've talked to some of them, you know, and I've heard about others. Just U.S. is not a place to be. Famously, in my own profession in economics, Esther Duflo and Amit Banerjee, 2 Nobel Prize winners, have left MIT to come to Europe. But it's part of I think, you know, America's lead in technology in science occurred because of the outflow from Europe in the 30s. This may be Europe's opportunity to the reverse. But so the bottom line is, A, we will resist. There will be people who will leave. Exit, Voice of Loyalty is a famous book by Albert Hirschman, and you're going to see all 3 of that. Exit is going to be, Voice is going to be heard, and there are going to be some people who are going to stay and do everything they can to stop this. The lawyers will be suing, court case after court case, but the Supreme Court in the United States, we do not know. We know that they're pretty bad. We don't know yet how bad. And that is going to be a critical piece in the puzzle of where we go and how fast our democracy dies.
Joe, I have a couple of house notes for everybody here, so please listen closely now. Please return your headphones to where you got them from. And secondly, don't forget, on November the 6th this year at 1900 at 7 o'clock in the evening at the Wien Museum, we have the next Wiener Vorlesung, which is Demokratisierung des Wissens, Isotyp und Otto Neurath. So don't miss it, of course, but before you contemplate Otto Neurath one more time, please join me in a rousing round of applause for Joseph Stiglitz.